François Mitterrand, the station master's son who rose to the presidency of France, died of prostate cancer today. What was the nature of his contribution to modern Europe? His close colleague Jacques Attali says he was a principled socialist and describes his flirting with Margaret Thatcher. And I'll be discussing François Mitterrand's achievements and drawbacks with John Lauchland, who wrote a highly critical biography of the president, and the French political scientist Anne-Marie Le Gloanec. From China, we report they embody a nation within their own ambitions. But in the case of François Mitterrand, the belief is at least partly justified. President Mitterrand, collaborator, adulterer, and yet somehow a figure of probity, carried within himself many of the ambiguities and contradictions of modern France. Gordon Brewer reports.
A nation gathered to mourn today. This was the loss of more than an individual, more even than a president. For good or ill, with all his contradictions, François Mitterrand had almost become France itself. He was the most ambiguous of men, the apostle of liberty who served in the wartime Vichy government, the committed European motivated by fear of Germany, and the left-wing president who oversaw the virtual destruction of socialism in France. May 1981, and Paris is swept up in a wave of euphoria. François Mitterrand had swept to power as the first socialist president, and the whole of Europe would tremble.
Donc que nous ayons un président, une politique et une majorité capables non pas de renverser le cours du siècle et d'arrêter le progrès de la technique, mais capable de trouver sa place à l'homme, au travailleur, pour qu'il vive et pour qu'il continue de participer à la production. Et cela, seul un socialiste le fera, jamais un homme de droite, jamais un conservateur.
But this was a socialist with a very strange past. Few of those celebrating that day were aware of this picture, Mitterrand, the extreme right-winger of 1935, on a demonstration against foreign students. Or this, Mitterrand with Marshal Pétain, while he served in the wartime Vichy government. By the time de Gaulle liberated Paris, Mitterrand was working for the resistance at considerable personal risk, but it set a tone. Had he changed his mind, or was he simply hedging his bets?
Well, I don't think he knew. I mean, he had been quite right-wing before the war. He'd been in the Croix de Fer. He'd been, you know, really almost a crypto-fascist in a way, like a lot of young men of his generation with that kind of background. And then he joined the Vichy government as a junior official, and I think he was, insofar as he had any political ideas, he thought that was the right thing to do. And then he moved and joined the resistance. There was a while when he was doing both at once. He was working for Vichy, where he was dealing a little bit with keeping tabs on communists and Jews. He was doing some fairly nasty things. But then he joined the resistance, and you could say he was an opportunist like many of them.
The war ended, the ambiguities continued. As de Gaulle fell from power, Mitterrand began his political career serving in a series of right-wing governments. At the start of the conflict in Algeria, he was Minister of the Interior. The only negotiation is war, he said. May 68 and Paris erupts, but Mitterrand is still not a socialist. It's only when things have died down and a generation of intellectuals has deserted the left that he takes over the Socialist Party. Again, it's unclear, was this a genuine conversion?
Well, I think he was a very ambitious man who found a Socialist Party in disarray, and he thought he could make something of it because he could not succeed on the other side of the political spectrum. He was a socialist in the same way as General de Gaulle was also a socialist in some way, who believed in greater equality and participation. To be a socialist means many different things.
Over the next decade, in alliance with the Communist Party, Mitterrand turned the left into a force in France for the first time since the war. But the promise of 81 didn't last long. 2 years later, faced with either abandoning the European monetary system or abandoning his socialist policies, Mitterrand did a U-turn, ditching the communists and abandoning socialism. It was a defining moment for the left in Europe. And it was the beginning of a long decline for the socialists. By 1986, Mitterrand was presiding over a conservative government and the fascist National Front was on the rise. By 1993, the socialists were crushed as a serious political force. But long before then, François, the socialist, who'd clung to power through all of this, had become François, the world statesman. Physically, he was a diminutive figure on the world stage. Intellectually, he had claims to greatness. It was Mitterrand, together with the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who was the architect of the Maastricht Treaty. There was an odd imbalance in the relationship between the two men and the countries they represented. France, scared of German power, keen to tie it closer to Europe. Germany, scared of its own history, just as keen to be tied in. The tension became most apparent when the Berlin Wall came down. Mitterrand was fiercely opposed to unification, changing his mind only when it became clear it would happen anyway. But the Franco-German axis was built. It was the British who were left by the wayside.
I think he was very important in the history of Europe, but only partly succeeded in his ambitions. His efforts went mainly into establishing close relationships with Germany. He was not the same sort of person as Chancellor Kohl. They were very different, but yet they managed to get on in some way, and their weakness was that they could not find a method for bringing England in. There was not half as much effort put into Franco-British relations as into Franco-German relations, and that is, I think, the weakness of his European work.
Units of the new Franco-German Corps displayed themselves on the Champs-Élysées. There was a cost, of course, to force France into the strictures of monetary union, but by the time the bills came to be paid, Mitterrand was gone. He was the president of symbols, and in this he was unsurpassed. A permanent coup d'etat, that's how Mitterrand described the Fifth Republic created by de Gaulle. But when he took over, he showed himself more than willing to use his powers to the full. There had already been hints Mitterrand was prepared to bend the rules. There were allegations an assassination attempt in the late 50s had been staged by Mitterrand himself, presumably to get publicity. Once elected, the telltale signs of power soon began to emerge. Some positive, the Grande Arche towering over the vista from western Paris towards the Arc de Triomphe, the pyramid at the Louvre. But there was a darker side. It turned out Mitterrand had an illegitimate daughter kept at state expense, and he presided over widespread corruption amongst his officials.
He didn't keep a strong enough tabs on the Socialist Party from a moral point of view. He was, by all accounts, extremely lax about corruption within his own ranks. It came out really before his death and certainly after his death, that some of the people very close to him in the Élysée were indulging in all these corrupt practices. And he was extremely, I think, cowardly and cynical in not doing enough to give France a strong moral lead at a time when there was growing corruption in all the parties.
Revelations about his friendship with René Busquet, police chief of the Vichy regime, ensured his final years were dogged by controversy. The French also wondered why the man who had supposedly broken with Pétain continued to send flowers to his grave until 1993. Aging and increasingly ill, Mitterrand became more and more aloof, the master manipulator become symbol of the French nation. Whatever his countrymen might make of him, he had, though, exercised an extraordinary influence over them.
His work as president was in many ways monarchical. He was a king, and when you saw him, he behaved like a king, and he kept distant, and he spoke to you in a voice which was barely natural. He wanted to be an enigma. If he had been born in India, he would have been a guru. If he'd been born in the Middle Ages, he would have been a magician. And in many ways, he was a magician, because he knew how to manipulate people, always keeping them surprised, not knowing what he was going to do next.
In a sense, Mitterrand really was France, a nation of resistance fighters, which was also a nation of collaborators, a nation whose striving for greatness often clashes with its diminished economic role in the world, a nation which swings from the radicalism of Robespierre and the 60s students to the authoritarianism of Bonaparte and de Gaulle, and which never seems quite sure which is closest to its heart.
Well, earlier I spoke to François Mitterrand's former advisor and confidant, Jacques Attali. I asked him if the former president was really a socialist.
Yes. A socialist, at least since the years 70s, when I met him and when we began to work together. Socialist means a man of revolt against all kind of injustice and trying to do his best to destroy the privileges and to build a more equitable society, certainly, yes.
And yet all those sweeping changes that he made, the nationalization program, for example, when he came in 81, all of that he abandoned, didn't he?
No, we can't say that. First, you have to remember that he was president while the parliament became conservative, and it's a conservative parliament who decided to give up some of the nationalization, but not all of them, some of them. He always was very proud of the nationalization, and I must say that if you look at the success of nationalization, they are a success because when we nationalized these companies in 81, there was no private holder available. And when they were privatized, it was a moment where these companies were quite in better shape when they were nationalized. And therefore, we must say that the public shareholder was an excellent one. And he was very proud of nationalizations.
When you worked closely with him, when you look back through his dealings with American presidents, with British prime ministers, did he have a particular problem with Anglo-Saxons?
No, but of course UK and US is not the same. We would have always been happy to see UK closer to Europe, and we would have been delighted to have a troika between France, UK and Germany instead of a couple between France and Germany. It was his dream, but unfortunately it was impossible because both Chancellor Kohl and himself considered Europe as a future nation, while Mrs. Thatcher considered Europe just as a club. And therefore there was a difference of paradigm, which was totally irreconcilable.
Did he respect Mrs. Thatcher?
Yes, definitely yes. He, more than respect, he admired her. He admired her rigor, her capacity of defending British interest, and her extraordinary brain. He also was amused when he saw and understood that she was also trying to use her women seduction abilities in some elements of negotiations.
Oh, how did that show itself?
Smiling, nothing more.
He enjoyed that, did he?
Of course. He said once that she had the voice of Marilyn Monroe and the eyes of Stalin.
Now, as regards his relationship with Germany, some of us find that a bit hard to understand. He was, of course, in favor of as rapid as possible integration within Europe, and yet it seemed to be tinged with a fear of Germany.
That's the same. Because of his knowledge of history, he knows that if Germany is alone and very strong, it's a danger for peace. Mrs. Thatcher was fearing German unification, and she was doing her best, actually not a lot, to filibuster. But François Mitterrand realized that German unification was unavoidable, and he always said German unification is a German problem, while the consequences of German unification is a European problem. And therefore, he put two conditions for German unifications. One was the recognition of the Oder-Neisse border with Poland before the unification. And second was a progress towards European integration, which was a single currency and the Maastricht Treaty. And we must say, and I think history will recognize, that single currency, you like it or not, but single currency is what François Mitterrand got from Chancellor Kohl in exchange of German unification. As far as international affairs is concerned, he gave the greatest push to the European dream that any other politician has ever done.
Well, let's get another view now of President Mitterrand, former President Mitterrand. Anne-Marie Le Gloanec is a political analyst in Paris, and John Laughlin joins us from Brussels. He's written a rather critical, a very critical biography of France under Mitterrand. Anne-Marie Le Gloanec, Jacques Attali, of course, was a pal, a political ally of President Mitterrand. For a more considered view from you, in your judgment, in the judgment of the ordinary person in the street in France, Was he a great man?
I think he was, definitely. And one of the things maybe one can most admire about him was his ability to turn blunders or mistakes into great achievements. For instance, German reunification. I think he probably tried, well, he definitely tried to put a brake on Germany's reunification, and he may have even tried to block it completely when he visited Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. But eventually, he understood he could not stop it, he could not put a brake on it, so he decided to push forward both Germany's reunification and Europe's unification.
OK, we'll come to the question of Europe in a second. I'd just like to get John Laughlin's view on the scale of greatness or unimportance. Where would you put Monsieur Mitterrand?
I think history will judge him as a very unimportant person, in the sense that he is a man who has presided not over any great achievements in French politics, but rather over a 14-year period of total drift. The only substantial policy with which his name is identified is obviously that of Europe. But apart from that, it's impossible to identify Mitterrand with any particular policy choices whatever. And I think that when one compares, for example, the history of France with the history of Britain during the 1980s, because it was obviously during the 80s that Mitterrand was most active, one will see that on the one hand in Britain there was a period of great dynamism and of great reform and of great political clarity, whether you agreed with it or not. And on the other hand, there was a confusion, there was no clear direction given to the country, and there was generally the peddling of illusions instead of the confronting of reality.
Right, now you dismiss Europe, which Anne-Marie has cited as a great achievement of his, just in a breath. Actually, the architecture of Maastricht and whether you like it or not, the duties it's put on the other countries in Europe was a huge achievement, wasn't it?
No, I didn't want to give the impression that I dismiss it. I think it is certainly a huge political fact that Mitterrand has contributed to European construction, and it's one which no one could deny. But I would just say this. Jacques Attali has told us that Mrs. Thatcher was opposed to German reunification, and he's implied that Mitterrand was not so. But as Anne-Marie Le Gouanec has just implied, on the contrary, Mitterrand himself undertook very great actions to try and prevent the liberation of East Germany from communism, actions which Mrs. Thatcher, of course, never even contemplated. And he only developed the Maastricht project for European Union after those actions had proved futile.
Now, Anne-Marie Le Gouanec, I mean, you say that's a great achievement of his, that he was able to rescue himself and his country from mistakes that he had made. It's not really a terribly great achievement, is it?
Well, I think it's a terribly great achievement if you realize that François Mitterrand, like other people of his generation, did not really like the Germans, was opposed to unification, but understood that he could take a U-turn, have it accepted by everybody, including the Germans. The Germans were happy to forget his mistake and blunder, and then to go ahead with a big project, which was Maastricht, and which is still Maastricht, instead of being sort of wishy-washy about it. I would like to contradict John Laughlin on the point that nothing was achieved in France during those 14 years. I think there were lots of problems, of course, and disarray as he has described, but there is something very important which happened in France, not so dramatic as in Great Britain, of course, but still you can say that France has changed terribly in those years, especially in the 80s, that France has opened its borders, that the French people have opened up their minds. I hope you may realize it, that the French have been reconciled with a kind of entrepreneurial taste, a taste for achieving things, including going abroad, investing abroad. This is very important. Of course, it was part of a worldwide trend of liberalization, but a socialist president helped very much the French to do this because he was socialist. He could have them accept doing this. And there were, of course, side effects, negative sides of this, like more money meant corruption, meant scandals, including scandals around Mitterrand himself. But I think these were big changes that we have to reckon.
You raised the question of scandal. What is quite hard for someone living in our political culture to understand is how a man with his checkered background could have risen to the supreme office in your country. I mean, John Laughlin, can you help us with that?
Well, I think it's shocking. I mean, you indicate that in your question, and I think from a British perspective it is shocking and should be so. And I think that it is this may sound rude to say it, but I think it is a weakness in French political culture that a man can get away with what has been proved to be systematic corruption and with entertaining relationships with people who are extremely dubious and yet get off scot-free. And I think, despite what Anne-Marie Gloanec says about the openness of France and so on, which I accept in broad terms, I think that Mitterrand's great legacy for France is a debasement of the political culture of the country, a weakening of democratic accountability, and a general sense of drift in the political decision-making of her leaders.
Go ahead,
yes,
please.
Yes, I would like to emphasize this, say that on the one hand, Mitterrand tried to modernize the country from the economic point of view. He tried also to modernize France politically and socially, but there he failed. I think this was probably the biggest mistake of these 14 years of presidency, that he tried to change the political landscape, he pushed aside the Communist Party, but at the same time he did mistakes, maybe let alone for one reason, a man alone himself cannot change a whole political landscape. He maneuvered a lot, he wrecked maybe the Socialist Party too, so he was a tactical man, with a great sense of tactics, but sometimes lacking a vision, at least as far as internal politics were concerned. So he could modernize the country economically, he could not modernize it politically, and the social debate, the political debate, suffered considerably under his presidency.
Anne-Marie Le Gloanec, John Laughlin, thank you both very much. Thank you.
And was ever present in international affairs. François Mitterrand died in his Paris office this morning at the age of 79 after a long struggle with cancer. He was the Republic's longest-serving president, standing down just last May after 14 years in power. His successor, Gaullist President Jacques Chirac, said, "A great figure has left us, and I salute him with emotion and respect." German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, Mitterrand's co-architect of the Maastricht Treaty, said, "Europe has lost a great statesman." Here, the Prime Minister, John Major, said he made an outstanding contribution to public life, particularly in France, throughout the post-war period. The stream of mourners outside his Paris office confirmed the admiration in which President Mitterrand was held, even as policies are now being introduced to dismantle his best-known achievements, particularly the socialist-inspired system of welfare, health and pensions. The funeral and burial will take place on Thursday at President Mitterrand's birthplace in southwest France. Peter Morgan of our diplomatic unit looks back at the life of François Mitterrand and assesses his contribution to the world political stage.
The French had many names for François Mitterrand. To admirers, he was France's uncle, or even its god. His enemies dubbed him François I. Mitterrand attracted these mocking titles because no one was quite sure who he was or what he stood for. He was a socialist president who allowed a conservative Jacques Chirac to inherit the Élysée. He was a cultured man, but one who once remarked that the greatest political quality was indifference. Machiavelli, it was said, should study Mitterrand, not the other way around.
He was at the center of all the great controversies of this period. He was at the center of all the great political battles. He has literally been the most representative figure of the French political scene for half a century. Nobody can get away from that. It's quite impossible to study French politics or French history since the war without taking into account what role François Mitterrand was playing at a particular time.
François Mitterrand was born in 1916. The son of a rural station master, he made his mark at his local school in the Charente. Young Mitterrand, they said, would not be part of any group unless he could be its leader. War disrupted Mitterrand's youthful ambitions. He joined the infantry, and as France fell to the Germans, he was wounded. He became a prisoner of war, and at his third attempt managed to escape. Back in France, Mitterrand worked at first for Marshal Pétain's pro-Nazi Vichy government. Later, he downplayed his ties with that regime and stressed his work for the resistance.
J'ai commencé ma vie politique pendant la résistance. C'est là que j'ai eu mes premières responsabilités.
But a recently discovered photograph showing Mitterrand with Marshal Pétain suggested a more uncomfortable truth. Mitterrand continued to lead a political double life, cultivating the extreme right and the extreme left to further his career.
It was known that François Mitterrand was born in a conservative family, and that he has entered in resistance during the war in 1942.
Soon after the liberation, Mitterrand joined the government as its youngest minister. He was still known as a man of the right. He ran 11 ministries in 11 years, including the Ministry for Overseas Colonies. But when de Gaulle returned to power in 1958, Mitterrand left the government. In political exile, the former conservative discovered socialism. De Gaulle always ridiculed the conversion. Others, though, sensed that Mitterrand was thinking ahead.
If he couldn't be the chief of de Gaulle, then he preferred opposition. And then he discovered the left. And so everybody who had in mind 20 years of a Mitterrand on the right wing discovered a Mitterrand being more and more on the left. Well, really, people say it's not possible. Could he really be sincere, you see?
The next 20 years were marked by frustration and failure. In 1968, Mitterrand overplayed his hand during the student riots. Bolstered by a pact with the much larger communists, he challenged de Gaulle for the presidency. Rashly, he offered himself as either president or prime minister and failed to win either. By the time Mitterrand made his third run for the presidency in 1981, he had a reputation as a loser. But the sitting president, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, was even less popular, and Mitterrand finally came to power, cast as the man of principle.
Aucune puissance au monde ne me fera jamais vous dire autre chose que ce que je pense.
Mitterrand's reign started with a rush of socialist enthusiasm. Banks and insurance companies were nationalized, welfare payments were raised, along with the minimum wage. But socialism in one country soon ran into trouble. The franc was devalued. Finance Minister Jacques Delors warned that Mitterrand's plans were undermining the economy. The experiment was over, and in 1986, the right took control of Parliament, sharing power with the pragmatic president. Advisors saw both sides of the head of state.
You know, the enormous amount of stories about jokes, but also stories about France's deep roots, anecdotes about country situations. The negative interested in what could be having visions, of course, but unable to look at long-term programming, but interested in what you can do on the...
But Europe was one area in which Mitterrand did make a difference. Under him, France became the great motor of European Union, the best way, in his view, to control a newly united Germany. The Maastricht Treaty will be his political testament. Mitterrand, like other Western leaders, was powerless, though, to stop a more brutal vision of Europe emerging in the former Yugoslavia. He was already ill with cancer when he visited Sarajevo at the height of its siege. Gestures like these, and France's strong commitment to the UN force in Bosnia, slowed the war, but did not stop it. By the early 1990s, Mitterrand's body and his past had caught up with him. Weakened by cancer treatment, the president lost two of his closest friends. Pierre Bérégovoy, the former prime minister, shot himself after the socialist election defeat in 1993. Another close advisor, François de Grossouvre, took his life. Mitterrand was said to have abandoned both men in their final days. In one of his last appearances, Mitterrand talked about his beloved books. The agnostic president was also asked what the real God might say to him if he went to heaven.
Je pense qu'il serait appelé à me dire, enfin, tu sais. J'espère qu'il ajouterait, sois le bienvenu.
Mitterrand was the most professional, by far, of any French politician since the war. People like Charles de Gaulle weren't really politicians, and frankly, he has not had his match in all those 50 years as a man who knows how politics works from the inside and who plays the game to the full. And he's left an enormous example for those who followed him.
Some real reforms, such as the end of death penalty in France, decentralization, hooking France to Europe, the building of a modern society in terms of decentralization, development of free TV and free radios, which were totally impossible at the end of the 70s if we were not there.
François Mitterrand also leaves a physical legacy to France in the form of his great projects, among them the Grand Arch at La Défense. Temples of brick and glass, like the family of pyramids at the Louvre, may well be his most durable monuments. Others, though, may conclude that the greatest project of all was Mitterrand himself.